On the morning of February 19th, 1943, the German 10th Panzer Division and the 21st Panzer Division rolled through Kasserine Pass in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia. What they found on the other side was not an army. It was the American Second Corps, 90,000 men who had been in North Africa for 3 months, who had fought only the Vichy French in Morocco and Algeria, who had never faced the Wehrmacht in open battle. Their commanders had not coordinated their positions. Their units had been scattered across the front in piecemeal fashion that invited exactly the kind of concentrated armored attack that Rommel was now delivering. Their communications between infantry and armor were unreliable. Their anti-tank doctrine was inadequate for German Panzer IVs, let alone the Tiger tanks that accompanied the assault. The battle lasted 5 days. In those 5 days, the American Second Corps retreated 50 miles. Of the 120 tanks deployed to defend the pass, 112 were destroyed. American casualties totaled 6,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The defensive line was obliterated. The German advance threatened to reach the supply depot at Tebessa, an outcome that would have placed the entire Allied position in North Africa in jeopardy. The advance was stopped, not by American resistance, but by a disagreement among German commanders about objectives, and by the arrival of British reinforcements at Thala that stabilized the line. Erwin Rommel withdrew on February 22nd. He had expected to find inexperienced soldiers. He found them. The Americans had not simply been defeated, they had been disorganized, confused, and routed by an opponent they were not prepared to face. He wrote afterward, "The tactical conduct of the enemy's defense had been first class." The individual American soldier, his use of terrain, his willingness to fight in chaos, had impressed Rommel. What had failed was everything above the soldier: command, coordination, doctrine, preparation. An enigma intercept from the German high command was more blunt. The Americans had shown themselves to be soldiers of limited quality, their commanders poor, their organization confused. They would need years of training before they could be considered a serious opponent. The intercept was transmitted on February 25, 1943. The Battle of El Guettar would begin on March 23, 1943. The Germans had 26 days to be right about the Americans. It was not enough. Friedendahl, who had commanded Second Corps at Kasserine, was removed within a week. His replacement was George S. Patton. Patton arrived at Second Corps headquarters on March 6, 1943. He had 17 days. The German assessment was accurate for the army that had existed at Kasserine. The question was whether that army was the army that would exist 35 days later. The German assessment assumed yes. Patton was going to demonstrate no. The failures at Kasserine had been specific and identifiable. Poor intelligence. American commanders had been surprised by the direction and weight of the German attack despite warning signs. Inadequate coordination. Infantry and armor had operated without the combined arms doctrine that the Wehrmacht had developed over years of fighting. Scattered deployment. 2 corps units had been positioned in isolated packets that could be defeated in detail. And command failure. Friedendahl had built his headquarters in an elaborate underground bunker 25 miles behind the lines and communicated through a command system that confused his subordinates and left his frontline commanders without clear orders in a fast-moving battle. American soldiers at Kasserine had fought with courage in many sectors. The failures were not individual, they were institutional. Failures of doctrine, training, and command. Institutional failures can be fixed. Patton understood this. He arrived at Second Corps headquarters on March 6th with a specific diagnosis of what had gone wrong and a specific prescription for what needed to change. He had 17 days to apply it before the next battle. This is the story of 35 days, of what the German High Command, with all its confidence and all its enigma intercepts, had failed to account for. The American Army could learn, faster than anyone in history. Patton's first orders at Second Corps were not about tactics, they were about helmets. Every soldier in Second Corps was required to wear his steel helmet at all times, not just in combat, but in rear areas, in mess lines, in latrines. Violations were punished with fines. Officers who failed to enforce the order faced relief from command. This seemed, to the men who received it, like the obsession of a martinet. They had been beaten by German tanks and German artillery and German tactical coordination, and their new commander was writing orders about helmets. Patton understood something that his men did not yet understand. An army that had been beaten as badly as Second Corps had been beaten at Kasserine was not suffering from a deficit of tactics. It was suffering from a deficit of discipline. The specific, automatic obedience that transforms a collection of individuals into a unit that functions under stress. The helmet order was not about helmets. It was about the reestablishment of the fundamental habit of military behavior, the understanding that orders were given and orders were followed, not negotiated, not evaluated for reasonableness, not complied with selectively. An army that would not wear its helmet when it was inconvenient would not hold its position when it was frightening. Patton spent his first week moving forward, to the front lines, to the unit positions, to the observation posts. He personally chewed out officers whose men were out of uniform, who had not policed their positions, who had allowed the small erosions of standards that Kasserine had produced. He was building what had been absent at Kasserine, the sense that standards mattered, that the army was a functioning institution with expectations rather than a collection of frightened individuals hoping to survive. This was not the only thing Patton changed. He reorganized the command structure. The piecemeal deployment that had allowed the Germans to defeat Second Corps in detail at Kasserine was replaced with concentrated positions and clear sectors of responsibility. He imposed combined arms coordination. Infantry would not advance without artillery preparation. Armor would not advance without infantry protecting its flanks. Close air support would be coordinated with ground operations, rather than flying missions that bore no relationship to what the troops on the ground were doing. He required forward command. Officers would be at the front, with their units, not in comfortable headquarters miles behind the lines. Patton himself spent his days at observation posts, where he could see the fighting and make decisions with current information. In 17 days, none of this could be fully internalized, but it was enough to change the immediate condition, to impose discipline where there had been chaos, to establish coordination where there had been isolation, to put commanders forward who understood the battle they were in. On March 17th, 11 days after Patton took command, the 1st Infantry Division under Major General Terry Allen moved forward and took the town of Gafsa without significant opposition. The Italian garrison retreated rather than fight. It was not El Guettar. It was not the German 10th Panzer. But it was movement. A unit executing an order with coordination and purpose, advancing rather than retreating, holding together rather than dissolving. The German High Command noted the American advance and identified it as a limited probing operation by an army not yet ready for serious combat. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, who had taken command from Rommel after the Desert Fox departed Tunisia for Germany on March 9th, held Rommel's opinion of American fighting quality. He sent the 10th Panzer Division to deal with them. The 10th Panzer was one of the finest armored formations in the Wehrmacht. France in 1940, Russia in 1941 and 1942, North Africa since late 1942. Its tank crews were experienced. Its commanders had been fighting the kind of mobile armored warfare that had destroyed Second Corps at Kasserine. Von Arnim had watched the Americans collapse at Kasserine. He had watched them retreat 50 miles. He had read the Enigma assessments of their quality. He expected the 10th Panzer to push them back again. He was sending his best formation against the American Army of February 1943. He was about to meet the American Army of March 1943. The German military had a theory about American soldiers. It was not an unfounded theory. It was based on observation, on the specific, professional assessment of officers who had watched American forces in combat and drawn conclusions from what they saw. The theory was this: American soldiers were individually brave, but institutionally weak. They fought with courage at the level of the squad and the platoon. They were physically strong, well-equipped, and willing to engage the enemy at close quarters. But they lacked the specific qualities that the Wehrmacht had spent decades developing: the tactical flexibility to adapt when a plan broke down, the initiative to make decisions without orders, the cohesion to maintain unit integrity under the kind of pressure that modern armored warfare produced. These qualities, the German assessment held, were the product of years of professional military training. Germany had begun building its army in 1933. By 1939, when the Wehrmacht first went to war, it was fighting with soldiers who had been trained continuously for 6 years, who had internalized the doctrine of combined arms, who had practiced the specific skills of coordinated infantry, armor, artillery operations until those skills were automatic. The American army in Tunisia in 1943 had been fighting for 15 months. This was the gap. Not in courage, not in equipment, but in the accumulated institutional experience that turned individual soldiers into a coordinated fighting force. The German assessment at Kasserine was not that American soldiers were cowards. Rommel had written that individual American tactical conduct had been first class. The assessment was that American institutions, command, doctrine, coordination, were not yet capable of matching German institutions. And institutions, the German theory held, could not be rebuilt in weeks. You could not take a broken corps and make it into a fighting force in 17 days. This was true of virtually every army in history. The Prussian military tradition, the French tradition, the British tradition, all of them assume that military capability was the product of years of continuous development. An army that had been shattered needed months at minimum to reconstitute. It needed to absorb the lessons of its defeat, retrain its units, rebuild its command structures, and restore the confidence that had been broken. Germany had done this after its defeats in the First World War. It had taken 4 years of the Reichswehr and 6 years of the Wehrmacht to rebuild German military capability to the point where it could win in Poland and France. 17 days was not enough. The German theory was correct. For every army that had ever existed, the American army of 1943 was not every army that had ever existed. The specific quality that the German assessment had not fully modeled, the quality that would become visible at Guettar, was the American military's relationship with failure. The Wehrmacht, like every European military tradition, treated defeat as a catastrophe to be analyzed, learned from over time, and incorporated into doctrine through the slow process of institutional revision. After the First World War, the German army had spent the Weimar years systematically studying why it had lost and developing the doctrine, Auftragstaktik, the emphasis on mission orders and decentralized initiative that would define the Wehrmacht's operational method in the Second World War. This process had taken years. The American army had a different relationship with failure. Not a better relationship necessarily, but a faster one. The American military culture, formed by citizen soldiers rather than professional conscripts, had developed a specific tolerance for rapid adaptation. The problem was identified. The solution was found. The solution was implemented. Not over years, not through formal institutional channels that moved at the pace of doctrine revision, but at the level of the battlefield itself, in the days and weeks after the failure occurred. This was what Patton was doing in his 17 days, not rebuilding the army. Identifying the specific failures, command, coordination, discipline, and applying specific fixes, fast. The German military assessment had not expected the fixes to come this fast. The fixes that Patton applied were not subtle. He fired officers. He fired them quickly, publicly, with the message that the standard had changed, and that commanders who could not meet it would be replaced. The officer corps of Second Corps had been shaped by Friedendahl's style, rewarding men who stayed close to headquarters, who managed upward, who produced paperwork. Patton's assessment method was different. He went to the front. He watched the officers perform. He formed opinions quickly and acted on them. General Orlando Ward, commanding the 1st Armored Division, received one of Patton's characteristic phone calls during the early operations towards Guettar. Ward mentioned that he had the good fortune of not losing any officers that day. Patton exploded. "God damn it, Ward, that's not fortunate. That's bad for the morale of the enlisted men. I want you to get more officers killed." Ward asked if Patton was serious. "Yes, God damn it, I'm serious. I want you to put some officers out as observers, well up front, and keep them there until a couple get killed. This was not sadism. It was the specific logic of the commander, who understood that an officer corps that was not at the front was an officer corps that was not leading. And an officer corps that was not leading was an officer corps that would produce the same result at El Guettar that it had produced at Kasserine. The lesson was received. The immediate effect of Patton's 17 days was visible in what happened on March 23rd. The 1st Infantry Division had been at Kasserine. Its soldiers had fought in the chaos of the retreat. Its commanders had experienced the specific disintegration of unit coordination that the battle had produced. By March 23rd, Major General Terry Allen's 1st Infantry Division was dug into the hills above the El Guettar Valley. The men had spent days preparing their positions, hacking at the rocky ground with picks and shovels, laying minefields, sighting anti-tank guns, positioning artillery to cover the approaches to the valley. They knew the Germans were coming. American signals intelligence had intercepted German communications indicating an attack was planned. The liaison between intelligence and command, the coordination that had failed at Kasserine, was working. When Colonel Herschel Baker briefed his 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion on the morning of March 23rd, he was direct. In their previous encounters with German tanks, at Usaltia, at Spatla, his men had run. This time, they were to hold on and fight it out, regardless of the odds. No retreat, no exceptions. This was the specific difference that Patton's 17 days had produced. Not new tactics, not new equipment. Not new soldiers. The same soldiers, now understanding that the standard had changed. That retreat was not an option. That holding the position was required. At 4 a.m., the roar of German tanks could be heard in the El Guettar Valley. Elements of the 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion's reconnaissance company fired on a German motorcycle scout team and captured one of the riders. Through rapid interrogation, Colonel Baker learned the attack would begin around 5 a.m. Baker passed the information to Allen. Allen positioned his forces. At 6 a.m., 50 panzers emerged from the pass. The German commanders expected the Americans to break. Allen's men were waiting for them. The German commanders attacking on March 23rd were operating on the intelligence of February 23rd. Their assessment was professional, detailed, and exactly 1 month out of date. The Americans at El Guettar were the same soldiers who had broken at Kasserine. A determined assault by the 10th Panzer would push them back again. The assessment was accurate about the soldiers. It was wrong about the system those soldiers were now operating in. The system had changed. Patton had changed it. In 17 days, working with the specific, unsentimental efficiency of a man who understood exactly what had failed, he had changed the system enough that the same soldiers who had broken in February were going to do something different in March. The German military intelligence had not tracked the system change. It had been tracking the soldiers. The soldiers were the same. The system was not. 50 German tanks were rolling into the valley. They were rolling into a different army than the one they had defeated a month earlier. At 6 a.m. on March 23, 1943, the 10th Panzer Division rolled into the El Guettar Valley. The ground before them was open, flat, rocky, crossed by dry riverbeds. In open ground, German armor had a decisive advantage. American infantry in fixed positions could be outflanked and overrun. American engineers had spent 3 days laying mines. The German tanks hit them before crossing the first mile. 8 tanks were destroyed. The column slowed, exposed on open ground, began the careful process of mine clearing. This was when the artillery began. American 155mm howitzers and 105mm field guns had been positioned in the hills with precise targeting data for every approach route through the valley. The artillery officers had spent 2 days registering their guns. When the German column slowed in the minefield, the artillery had a stationary target on pre-registered ground. The first salvos fell at 6:30 a.m. Patton, watching from an observation post on the high ground, saw the German formation take the hits. He described it afterward. "My God, it seems a crime to murder good infantry like that." The Panzer Grenadiers and half-tracks were caught in the open when the artillery began. The American artillerymen employed airbursts over the infantry and skipping rounds along the valley floor. The Panzer Grenadiers had no cover. The tanks continued. 30 panzers pushed past the minefield and drove toward the American positions. The 601st Tank Destroyer Battalion opened fire with their M3 half-track tank destroyers. They were outgunned. They held anyway. Lieutenant Slim Yowell's 1st Platoon, down to 3 tank destroyers and 11 men by mid-morning, spent the early afternoon in concealment behind a ridgeline, waiting for the panzers to come within range. When the German tanks turned to engage the infantry on the hill, exposing their flanks, Yowell's men opened fire. The engagement lasted the rest of the morning. American 57mm anti-tank guns and the tank destroyer's 75mm rounds caught German tanks in the flanks as they turned to engage infantry on the hills. The German attack was designed for open country, for the kind of wide sweeping advance that had broken the Americans at Kasserine. The minefield had forced them into a compressed column. The artillery had caught them stationary. The tank destroyers had engaged them at ranges the German commanders had not anticipated. By noon, 30 German tanks had been destroyed or disabled. The 10th Panzer had lost over half its operational armor. The Panzer Grenadiers had retreated to the far end of the valley. The attack had not penetrated to the American artillery positions or to Allen's headquarters, though at one point, 2 German tanks came close enough that his staff urged him to relocate. Allen's response: "I will like hell pull out, and I'll shoot the first bastard who does." He did not pull out. The 10th Panzer Division withdrew at noon, 30 tanks destroyed. The attack, launched by one of the finest armored formations in the Wehrmacht, against an American corps that had been routed by a similar force 33 days earlier, had failed. Not failed narrowly, failed completely. The German infantry was excellent. Its training was superb. Its individual soldiers were, by any measure, as capable as any in the war. They were being destroyed not by superior American soldiers, but by superior American organization, by artillery properly coordinated with infantry, by anti-tank guns properly positioned, by commanders at the front making decisions with current information, by the specific institutional transformation that Patton had forced in 17 days, the transformation the German assessment had decided was impossible, by discipline that insisted on holding a position under pressure that would have broken the same formation 33 days earlier. The 10th Panzer Division ended the day of March 23rd with 26 operational tanks. It had begun the day with 50. The German assessment of American military capability had been accurate on February 19th. On March 23rd, the same assessment was catastrophically wrong. Not because the Americans had become different soldiers, not because they had received new equipment or new doctrine from Washington, not because 35 days of calendar time had somehow produced the years of professional development that the German theory said was necessary, because the system around the soldiers had changed. This is the distinction that the German assessment had not fully modeled, the distinction between the quality of individual soldiers and the quality of the institutions those soldiers operated within. An institution can change faster than a soldier can be trained. The Wehrmacht had spent 6 years building its institutional excellence. Combined arms coordination, Auftragstaktik, the decentralized initiative that allowed platoon commanders to make decisions without waiting for orders. Products of continuous development from 1933 to 1939, baked into professional culture until automatic under stress. The American Army in Tunisia in 1943 had 15 months of experience, but it had something the German Army had not accounted for: a culture of rapid institutional learning that treated failure not as a catastrophe, but as data. Kasserine had produced data, specific data. The command structure had failed. The coordination between infantry and armor had failed. The deployment had been too scattered. The commanders had been too far from the fighting. The anti-tank doctrine had been inadequate. These were not vague lessons requiring years of doctrinal revision. They were specific problems with specific solutions. Friedendahl was the wrong commander. Solution: Patton. The command structure was too hierarchical and slow. Solution: Forward commanders with authority to make decisions. The artillery was not coordinated with the infantry. Solution: joint fire planning that integrated artillery, infantry, and air support. The deployment was too scattered. Solution: concentrated positions with clear sectors of responsibility. The anti-tank doctrine was inadequate. Solution: tank destroyer battalions properly positioned in depth with orders to hold rather than withdraw. Each solution was implementable in days. Patton had 17 days. He implemented all of them. Not perfectly. The American army at El Guettar was not the polished fighting machine that the Wehrmacht represented. The combined arms coordination worked in the defensive battle, but remained imperfect in the counterattack phase. Patton himself was removed from Second Corps Command in April to plan the Sicily invasion. El Guettar was not the end of the process. It was the demonstration that the process worked. The German assessment had said American institutions could not change fast enough. The American army had changed fast enough. Not completely, not finally, but enough. Enough to hold the line. Enough to stop the 10th Panzer. Enough to demonstrate that the army that had broken at Kasserine was capable of being rebuilt in a time frame that the German theory said was impossible. Von Arnim, assessing the El Guettar engagement in his after-action report, noted that the Americans had fought considerably better than at Kasserine. He attributed it to Patton's leadership. He was right. He did not fully appreciate that Patton's leadership had demonstrated something about the American military that would have implications well beyond Tunisia. The American army could learn faster than any army in history. German commanders who lost battles consistently produced after-action analyses that correctly identified what had gone wrong. They made the same analysis Patton made after Kasserine. The difference was speed of implementation. The German military implemented its lessons over months and years. The American military implemented them in days. This asymmetry, German excellence in identifying lessons, American excellence in applying them, would define the dynamic between the two armies for the rest of the war. At Kasserine, the Germans had been right. At El Guettar, 35 days later, they were wrong. The army had changed faster than anyone expected. That was the lesson the Enigma intercept had not contained. The process that produced El Guettar from Kasserine was not unique to Tunisia. It repeated itself, with variations, with different commanders and different units, throughout the American involvement in the Second World War. The pattern was consistent: early failure, rapid diagnosis, faster than expected correction. The Battle of Savo Island in August 1942 had cost 4 Allied cruisers, catastrophic failures in night fighting doctrine and communications. Within 15 months, the American Navy had developed radar-guided torpedo tactics. At Cape St. George in November 1943, Captain Arleigh Burke's Destroyer Squadron 23 sank 3 Japanese destroyers without loss, executing exactly the doctrine that Savo Island's failure had produced. The pattern appeared in the air war as well. The early American strategic bombing campaigns over Europe had demonstrated that unescorted B-17s could not survive German fighter opposition at acceptable loss rates. The raid on Schweinfurt in October 1943 had cost 60 bombers in a single mission. The loss rate was unsustainable. The specific failure? No escort fighter with sufficient range to accompany bombers to the target. The solution? The P-51 Mustang with drop tanks, which had the range to escort bombers to Berlin and back. By early 1944, the Schweinfurt loss rate of 20% per mission had been transformed into a sustainable campaign. 4 months. The German military, observing these patterns, developed a specific frustration that appears repeatedly in the correspondence of senior German officers. The Americans learned too fast. Rommel, who had more direct experience with American forces than most German commanders, had articulated the problem after Kasserine. The Americans, he wrote, were learning quickly, more quickly than he had expected from a nation with no tradition of professional military service. He expected them to learn. He did not expect them to learn in 35 days. The German military tradition had a concept for this: Lernbereitschaft, the capacity for learning. German doctrine valued it. German officer education developed it. German after-action reviews institutionalized it. What German doctrine had not accounted for was an opponent whose Lernbereitschaft operated at a fundamentally different speed. Not because American officers were more intelligent, but because the American military institution had a different relationship with hierarchy and the pace of change. German military culture valued thoroughness. A lesson identified at the unit level would be reviewed, formalized, incorporated into doctrine, distributed through the officer education system, and internalized across the force. Excellent doctrine. Months to produce. American military culture valued speed. A lesson identified at the unit level would be tried immediately, evaluated based on results, and discarded or continued based on whether it worked. Messier, less elegant, but it happened in days. This was not a gap in quality, it was a gap in velocity. The Germans were better at getting to the right answer. The Americans were better at getting to an answer quickly. In a war that moved fast, velocity mattered more than perfection. Patton had demonstrated this at Second Corps. The demonstration would be repeated at every subsequent level of American military engagement in the war. Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, Normandy. Each campaign began with failures. Each failure was diagnosed. Each diagnosis was applied. Faster than anyone expected. Faster than the German military theory said was possible. The theory was right about what was required. It was wrong about how long it would take. The German High Command returned repeatedly to this observation in communications that Allied cryptanalysts were reading throughout the war. American forces improved faster than comparable German experience suggested they should. The frustration was not about any single battle. It was about the trajectory. At Kasserine, the trajectory had been pointing down. At Guettar, the trajectory had reversed, and it would not reverse again. The American capacity for rapid institutional learning had a source. It was not in the military tradition. America had almost no professional military tradition before the Second World War. The standing army was small, underfunded, and peripheral to American national life in the years between the wars. The source was in the culture that surrounded the military, the civilian culture of the country that had built the army. American civilian culture was organized around adaptation. The automobile industry that had produced the Jeep and the Sherman tank was an industry built on rapid iteration. Try something, measure the results, change what didn't work, try again. The assembly line's specific logic, standardize the process, measure the output, optimize continuously, was the logic of rapid institutional learning applied to manufacturing. The military was not an automobile factory. But the officers who commanded the American military in 1943 had been formed in a culture that expected institutions to adapt quickly. They had grown up in a country where companies that failed to adapt went bankrupt, where products that didn't work were replaced by products that did, where the assumption was that problems had solutions and that the solutions could be found and implemented faster than the competition could respond. This cultural assumption, transported into the military, produced a different approach to failure than the German tradition offered. The German tradition asked, why did this happen, and what does it tell us about our doctrine? The American tradition asked, what broke, and how do we fix it by tomorrow? Both questions were necessary. The German question produced better long-term doctrine. The American question produced faster, short-term correction. In a war where the next battle was 35 days away, the American question was more useful. Patton was the specific embodiment of this cultural tendency. He was not a theorist. He was not a doctrinal innovator in the sense that Guettarian was, developing armored warfare concepts that defined the Wehrmacht's operational method. Patton's contribution was not new ideas. It was the velocity of implementation. At Second Corps, Patton had not invented new tactics. He had applied existing American doctrine, combined arms, forward command, concentrated deployment, with the urgency of a man who understood that the next battle was coming, whether the army was ready or not. The doctrine existed. Patton implemented it in 17 days. This was the thing the German assessment had not modeled, not the doctrine itself. German doctrine was superior to American doctrine in many respects. Not the individual soldiers. German soldiers were at least equal to American soldiers in individual fighting quality. The thing the German assessment had not modeled was the velocity. How fast an American commander could identify what was wrong, strip out what wasn't working, and replace it with something that would. Von Arnim had sent the 10th Panzer Division against an American corps that he believed was essentially the same as the corps that had broken at Kasserine. He was right that the soldiers were the same. He was right that 35 days was not enough time to train them to a different standard. He was wrong about what 35 days was enough time to do. It was enough time to change the system. It was enough time to change the commanders. It was enough time to change the coordination. It was enough time to turn the army that had broken at Kasserine into the army that held at El Guettar. Not a better army in every sense, a different army, different enough. The German after-action report described the American defense as unexpectedly competent, artillery coordination effective, anti-tank defense well organized and aggressive. None of this language would have been applied to Second Corps at Kasserine. The report did not say the Americans had become excellent. It said they had become competent. Competent was enough. Competent stopped the 10th Panzer Division. Von Arnim had sent his best formation against the Army of February. He found the Army of March. That was the 35 days. The Tunisia campaign ended on May 13, 1943. The German and Italian forces in North Africa surrendered. 250,000 men, the largest Axis capitulation of the war. The army that Rommel had built over 2 years of desert fighting, the army that had broken the American Second Corps at Kasserine in February, ceased to exist as a military force. The Americans had played a specific role in this outcome, not the decisive role. Montgomery's 8th Army had borne the weight of the campaign from the east. But the American role had changed in a specific and visible way between February and May. The Second Corps that entered Tunisia in November 1942 had been routed at Kasserine. The Second Corps that accepted the surrender of German units in May 1943 was a different institution. The German prisoners who surrendered in May 1943 were surprised not by the fact of defeat, but by the quality of the American forces that had defeated them. They were disciplined, organized, professionally competent in the ways that professional soldiers recognize professional competence. German prisoners who had fought on the Eastern Front, as well as in Tunisia, were blunt. American soldiers were learning fast. This was the same observation Rommel had made after Kasserine, before El Guettar. He had been right then. The prisoners were right in May. The process of rapid learning that had produced El Guettar from Kasserine was continuing. The lessons of Tunisia were being absorbed at every level, incorporated into training programs, written into doctrine revisions, transmitted to units that would be fighting in Sicily and Italy and eventually Normandy. Patton moved to plan the Sicily invasion. Omar Bradley took command and continued the improvement. The 1st Infantry Division, Allen's Big Red 1, that had held at El Guettar, would go ashore at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944. The lessons of El Guettar were in its muscle memory. Those soldiers, or soldiers trained by them, or soldiers who had absorbed the institutional lessons they had produced, were the soldiers who crossed the Channel. Kasserine was 18 months behind them. El Guettar was 15 months behind them. Normandy was ahead. The army that landed in Normandy had internalized, over 2 years of combat, the capacity demonstrated for the first time in those 35 days. Fail, identify the failure, correct it, faster than the enemy expected. Not just El Guettar, every battle in between. Each engagement produced failures. Each failure was diagnosed. Each diagnosis was applied. Failed in Tunisia, corrected in Tunisia. Failed in Sicily, corrected in Sicily. Failed in Italy, corrected in Italy. Arrived in Normandy with 2 years of accumulated corrections. Not a perfect army, not the best army. An army that got better faster than any army before it. Rommel had seen this coming after Kasserine. He had not seen how fast it would come. The German Enigma intercept of February 25, 1943, had said the Americans would need years of training before they could be considered a serious opponent. By May 1943, they had become a serious opponent, not because years had passed, because 35 days had passed, and then 35 more, and 35 more after that, until the army that had been broken at Kasserine was the army that would liberate Paris, cross the Rhine, and accept the German surrender at Reims on May 7th, 1945. One failure at a time, one fix at a time, faster than anyone expected. The German army at Omaha Beach was the same German army that had beaten the Americans at Kasserine. The American army at Omaha Beach was not. That asymmetry, the learning speed, was the 35 days, repeated until it became a war. The German High Command had been right about almost everything. They had been right that American soldiers in February 1943 lacked the institutional experience of German soldiers. They had been right that Kasserine exposed specific and serious weaknesses in American command, coordination, and doctrine. They had been right that the American Second Corps, as it existed in February, was not a match for the Wehrmacht. They had been wrong about one thing. They had been wrong about how long it would take to change. This error shaped the German strategic calculation about how much time they had before American forces became a serious factor in the European war. The Atlantic Wall could hold long enough. The air campaign could be absorbed. The Axis position could be maintained until American forces matured. The calculation was off by years. Guettar happened in March 1943, Sicily in July, Italy in September, D-Day in June 1944, Paris in August 1944, the Rhine in March 1945. At each point, German assessments underestimated what the Americans had become. Not because the Americans had become excellent. The American army at Normandy was not the equal of the German army in individual unit quality or tactical sophistication. German commanders noted that American units were more cautious, more dependent on material superiority, less flexible. They were right. American forces were also present in overwhelming numbers, supplied at rates the German army could not match, supported by air power that had become dominant over the battlefield, and getting better at every level of the organization at a rate the German army could not sustain. In 27 months, the American army learned to do things it had not known how to do, not by studying them in peacetime, but by failing at them in combat, identifying what had failed, and correcting the failure faster than the enemy expected. None of these had been mastered at Kasserine. All of them had been incorporated into doctrine by the time the war ended. Not through years of peacetime training, through the compounding process of failure and correction that the American military executed faster than any army in history. The German army was also learning. Its after-action reports were thorough, its doctrinal revisions were excellent, its tactical adaptations were professional. But German learning happened at German speed. American learning happened at American speed. Over 27 months, from Kasserine in February 1943 to the German surrender in May 1945, the speed differential compounded. These two facts were not in contradiction. Germany's pre-war training produced individual and unit excellence that the American army never fully matched at the tactical level. But excellence at the tactical level is not what wins a 4-year global war. What wins a 4-year global war is the capacity to fail and recover. Kasserine was the failure. Guettar was the recovery. 35 days. The Schweinfurt raid was the failure. P-51 escorts to Berlin was the recovery. 4 months. Savo Island was the failure. Cape St. George was the recovery. 15 months. The intervals got shorter as the war went on. The American army got faster at learning as it accumulated more experience with failure. The German army got better at fighting an army that was getting better at learning. It was not a competition Germany could win. Germany trained its army for years before the war. America built an army that learned faster than any in history. Kasserine was February. Guettar was March. 35 days between rout and victory, between collapse and resistance, between an army that broke and an army that held. The German assessment of February 25th said the Americans would need years. The Americans needed 35 days. Not to become excellent, to become competent. Competent was enough at Guettar. Excellent would come later. One failure at a time, one fix at a time. Faster than anyone expected. That was the difference.